A lot of you might have seen our reporting as of late on the possible legalization of marijuana, recreational use, adult use, however you want to say it, here in New York State. We aired 3 pieces. That's all on rochesterfirst.com. We got as deep as we could in 3 minutes, but we wanted to go deeper. So I invited Jason Klimek. He is with Boylan Code. He is a policy wonk when it comes to this stuff. Now, I want to be upfront. Jason does have a position on this. He is a Democrat. He does support one of the plans that's on the table pretty much. But I brought him in because he helped me through this process. And as we want to get more detailed here, I know that he can be a great resource. Welcome.
Thank you, Adam, for having me.
Of course. So before we get into any of the detailed stuff or air some of the pieces that we've been airing over the last 3 or 4 days, I want to ask you this. I think everybody assumes at this point that come April 1st, when the budget is due in Albany, that legalization of recreational marijuana will be legalized in New York State. I walked away with the impression, after talking with you, law enforcement, a lot of other players involved here, that this is not a guarantee. Do you think that that is the right impression to have?
Honestly, I think it is pretty likely. You know, if I had to put it at the odds of legalization, I would say 99%, maybe even better. I think, you know, the state is really looking to do it, and even though there are policy differences between the legislature and the governor's office, I think both really want this to go forward, really want the jobs, the revenue, the community reinvestment, the social equity, and really helping disproportionately impacted communities.
I agree that the energy is there this year, and clearly on the governor's side, he has a $15 billion deficit to fill, so there's perhaps heightened pressure to get the revenue from this for him. At the same time, some of the issues that have tripped this up in the past 2 years, they appear to still be there between the two proposals.
Absolutely right. So, you know, some of the big ones have been, and my personal topic is the taxes. Those have been a huge issue. Opt-out provisions, the governor's bill provides for one, the legislature provides for a different. And probably the biggest topic between the two is community reinvestment and the money allocations there.
All right, we're going to get into the details there. Before we do, we want to go over to Massachusetts, where it has been legal since 2018. We went to Lee, Massachusetts. There's one dispensary in town. They allowed us in. We talked with the CEO and also the police chief there. Here's what we found. If you hop off the Mass Pike right over the New York State border and swing by this store in Lee, Massachusetts, you'll find
the flower is definitely the highest percentage of sales.
An artisan shop.
This is Wiseacre Farms.
Of sorts.
This is all grown and manufactured right here in Massachusetts.
Welcome to Canna Provisions, a marijuana dispensary.
When you walk into the store, you really feel like you're in the Berkshires.
Meg Sanders opened this 2.5 years ago.
Business is phenomenal. I mean, it is absolutely been gangbusters since we opened.
That's a lot of tax revenue, but not a lot of congestion anymore. EMMY Davis runs Starving Artist Cafe down the street.
At first it was hard because the grocery store is past the pot shop, and so you had to drive by. There's a lot of traffic, but it's kind of thinned out. It's been pretty good.
Lee Police Chief Craig DeSantis had his doubts about this whole thing and still does. But when asked whether he's seen more cases of impaired driving,
I don't want to speak for other communities. I haven't seen an uptick here in our town, but it's a real concern. Officers can use assessments, but it's not the same. The courts don't recognize those assessments to be the same as field sobriety tests related to alcohol.
Now in Lee, Canna Provisions is the only game in town. In fact, there's only about 100 dispensaries across the entire state. Ann Sanders says a lot of them are owned by smaller entrepreneurs.
They didn't create a competitive licensing scheme. So there's no limit at the state level to licenses. And what they did is they left that up to local municipalities to figure out exactly how they wanted this to be in existence.
So now a product you buy here is very much legal, but drive a few miles west over the New York State border and it is very much not. That said, this does not stop a lot of New Yorkers from doing it. So joining me once again, Jason Klimek. He has been very involved in this particular issue. I'm guessing that as you've started to help craft the legislation around this, you've looked across the country. What states in particular have you been most interested in?
Well, I think Colorado probably provides one of the best models that we've seen insofar as what works for the tax revenue side. Certainly, Colorado has had issues when you're looking at the social equity side of it. And I think as we've seen states progressively legalize, we've seen more focus on the social equity, so states like Michigan and things like that. But when I'm looking at some of the revenue issues and really trying to tamp down the illicit market, Colorado has proven a pretty good model to at least start the conversation with.
All right, we are going to get wonky here for a minute. And to start this, I think we all have to understand that we have two competing proposals in Albany right now. We have one from Governor Cuomo's office. It's built into his larger budget that he's put out recently that he wants passed by April 1st. The legislature has put out its own. The legislature, most people just call it MRTA, M-R-T-A. They just say, oh, the MRTA plan. And then the governor's is CRTA, C-R-T-A, and they'll just say CRTA. When it comes to taxes, CRTA has a two-tiered system, from what I understand. They will tax the wholesale part of this. So if I'm the farmer and I'm growing this, they'll say, here's a certain amount of money based on the amount of THC involved or in the product. And then once the product is on the shelves, you walk into a dispensary, you buy, there's a 10.25% state tax in addition to the sales tax. So it's a two-tiered system. Tell me what the difference is when it comes to MRTA.
So the legislature's plan has actually, initially, or maybe 2 years ago, it was closer to the governor's plan when the governor's plan was a weight-based plan. Last year, and reintroduced again this year, they basically brought it down to an 18% tax at wholesale and a 4% tax at retail, and they exempted it from the normal 8% sales tax.
So in the end, would there be a revenue difference between the two plans for the state?
So if we isolate all the variables, yes. But my position all along has been, if you tax it too high, you actually decrease your revenue. So I think in practicality, the lower tax rates will actually produce more revenue for the states.
But if the same amount is bought, theoretically,
yes.
Then, and the argument for the legislature's plan is that if it's too high, people will still buy from what some people call the black market, legacy market, underground market, whatever you want to say, the illicit part of this. Has that been the case in other states? Because it hasn't been. You go to Lee, Massachusetts, it's not cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in Colorado, there's still an illicit market, but we don't see it flourishing. Whereas states like California, which have some of the highest taxes on cannabis, we do see it there, because what I've at least found through my research is that consumers are very, very price sensitive. So they're willing to tolerate a little bit above the illicit market because of safety. If you know what you're getting a regulated product, they will allow for a slightly higher price. If you go too much higher, they will go back to the illicit market, because a lot of them have been using that market for, could be decades. And so it's very difficult to pull them away when prices such as under the CRTA could be double the illicit market.
Yeah, that is interesting. By the way, a total side note, but something that I found interesting. And first of all, you have to remember that when I became a journalist 20 years ago, when we talked about marijuana, it was only the illicit market. We weren't even talking really about legalization. I mean, there were voices that were advocating for that, but mainly it was the illicit. To see this spelled out in legislation right now, and when it gets the legalese involved, is just unbelievable. And one point that I thought was fascinating is, when we talk about THC, the actual chemical, the drug that causes that, what's the proper term, the psychedelic impact, if you will, or the actual impact on the body, that's not in the flower itself when it's being grown. It actually has to be burned at a 300-degree temperature or something, which impacts the measurement when the state tries and taxes this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you bring that up. I was emailing a colleague today, and after I was doing some technical analysis, I said, can we just take a second to realize that I'm talking about the taxation of eighths of marijuana in a professional email. If only my teenage self could see what I was doing.
No, it's bizarre. Yeah, it was a little off-putting as I delved into this. So the next piece we're going to talk about, because we talk about the illicit market, a lot of that comes from people who are growing in their homes or whatnot. That is a huge component here. And you have CERTA that basically says no home grow. You can only buy it from a dispensary. And you have MRTA, the legislative proposal that says you can grow 6 plants. One person, is it 12 plants if you have 2 people in the home?
I believe so, yes.
Something like that. Yeah. So there's a difference there, and this was our reporting on it.
Will you be paying with debit or cash?
Yes. A lot of money flows through Canna Provisions in Lee, Massachusetts.
Donald, they'll be with you very shortly. Okay, very good. Thank you.
But its CEO, Meg Sanders, says making a dispensary profitable is not all that easy.
It's a highly regulated industry, which immediately makes it very expensive to enter.
Which is why she says many dispensaries want to grow their own marijuana to bring down cost. Now in Massachusetts, one company can have a license to sell and to grow. Canna Provisions has their shop in Lee, and then about 20 minutes up the road in Sheffield, they have their cultivation facility.
People from the Northeast definitely know who ChemDog is, and we are just thrilled that he is leading the charge at our cultivation with his amazing strains and amazing knowledge of the plant.
Whether dispensaries will be able to grow their own marijuana in New York is still unknown. Same with whether folks will be able to grow their own marijuana at home. Governor Cuomo's proposal does not allow that. The Assembly's does.
Just like you can brew beer in your home, you can develop wine in your home, those kind of things. We want to afford citizens the opportunity to do the same thing with growing marijuana. Oneida County Sheriff Rob Mashel, speaking on behalf of the state's Sheriff's Association, does not support legalization, period, but says if it is going to happen, no home grow means many people will still buy on the black market.
You can only possess it if you buy it, and if you pay the 10%, 10.25% tax that the governor's putting on it.
While a high price tag might scare off some from dispensaries, if this trip showed us anything, it's that many will still pay a premium to buy marijuana that's grown expertly and sold legally. Jason Klimek from Boyle & Code rejoins us now. When it comes to home grow, how much of a sticking point is this when you talk to your colleagues?
I think certainly on the consumer advocacy side, it's a huge sticking point. You know, we have a local organization, Rock Normal. It's the local chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And a year or two ago, we had an event where we invited local craft brewers. And basically the sum and substance, it was a legalization event, but the sum and substance of it was, would you be where you are today if home brewing was illegal? And the universal answer was no. So what home grow is, in addition to allowing people to access the cannabis market who maybe can't afford the prices at stores, is it also allows entrepreneurs to potentially start to develop a craft and then open their own businesses.
Yeah, it is interesting. When I asked Governor Cuomo's office about this, they said, look, we want to make sure that what people get, this is a drug, and what people get is safe and up to a certain standard, and they are opposing at this point home grow because they feel that they can't then monitor and regulate this if people are growing it at home. The folks you're working with, what's been their response to the governor's concerns?
I think that it certainly is a concern. We want regulated, safe products, but it's not enough to move the needle on they shouldn't be able to grow at home. I mean, you can't. There's no prohibition on growing tomatoes at home, and granted, tomatoes are not psychoactive, but it's something that I think that they are very adamant on needs to be in the legislation, because it allows access to the markets for the populations that they're really trying to help who may not be able to afford the legal market, and it does support, the eventual small businesses.
Yeah. We want to get to the other piece now because there are some major differences when it comes to where the tax revenue goes, and Jason got into that a little bit earlier. This piece explains a little bit more the differences that are written out in policy. Take a look.
I don't know if you need to do that.
Meg Sanders says it wasn't just business that led her into the role of CEO of this marijuana dispensary in Lee, Massachusetts.
We have to stop criminalizing people because of this plant. That just has to stop. And I think that's what we support, that's what we stand for, and that is hands down one of the biggest drivers for me.
That social justice component is woven into both legalization plans being considered in Albany. One is Governor Cuomo's, the other is the legislature's. Assemblyman Harry Bronson says the legislature's differs in several ways. One, criminalization. Right now, having a small amount of marijuana is just a violation, not a misdemeanor. The legislature's plan keeps it that way, while the governor's says once regulated marijuana is legal, possession of unregulated marijuana would go back to being a misdemeanor. Another difference, where tax revenue goes. Bronson says the legislature's plan sends 50% into a community reinvestment grant program.
We want to make sure that a portion of the money, it's set out specifically, a certain percentage, will go to underserved communities. A portion of the money will go to establishing those micro businesses so that folks can participate, whether it's in the growing component or the retail component of this industry. And then lastly, for entrepreneur programs and things of that nature and social programs.
Cuomo's office says their plan does promise some money for those programs and will offer some 0% loans to disadvantaged applicants. Oneida County Sheriff Rob Mashel opposes legalization in general, but takes particular umbrage at the loan offer.
Are you kidding me? I mean, we've got dairy farmers, New York's biggest industry, or at least in Oneida County where I'm from, it's Oneida County's biggest industry, agriculture. Dairy farmers are going under because they can't survive, and they don't get 0% loans to keep their business floating. But if you want to sell marijuana, we'll give you 0% interest loans.
What's notable is these concerns are not new, and some have stopped legalization efforts in the past. And it remains possible, as many New Yorkers wait for the green light, they'll do so again. Before we get to the specifics of where the money is going to go, the programs that we were just talking about in that report, why don't we lay out how much money the state is hoping to get from the legalization? What I found interesting is it's not going to be $350 million like that. It's tax-based. So, in fact, this year, we may not see much at all, right?
Absolutely. So the market, the legal market has to grow. Initially, you're probably going to see, under both bills, the current medical cannabis companies are allowed to be in the adult use market if they obtain the proper licensing. So you'll probably see some revenue start to flow from that, but it's going to take time for the small businesses to start up and the state really starting to generate revenue. And so, we might be looking at really the revenue ball rolling a year, 2 years down the road.
Mm-hmm. And then we're going to rev up to the point, plus $300 million or so, do you think?
And I think that, yes, but I think that's the low end. Okay. So the initial report from the Department of Health done back in around 2018 was, I think, 300 million on the low end, something like 600, 700 on the high end. But then the Rockefeller Center for Government came out a year or so later with their report and said, well, if we look at the entire market, if we look at the jobs created and the taxes generated from that, we're actually into the billions in how much tax revenue can be generated holistically.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of where the money is going to go, I do want to step back and say and acknowledge that there is a significant group of people, especially in the law enforcement community, who oppose legalization, period. So while we're talking about the nuances between two plans that both legalize marijuana, there's a whole group that says we shouldn't even be talking about this because it shouldn't be legal. I want to acknowledge that. We're not talking about that today because we've talked about that certainly over the years. The point here is to talk about what we're actually dealing with and what we'll likely see in the coming weeks and the coming months here in New York State. On that note, those who support MRTA say our bill does a better job at channeling money to communities that have been, in their words, disproportionately impacted negatively by the drug war. I brought that to Governor Cuomo's office, and they said, well, we certainly are going to be giving money to programs that MRTA would support as well. The difference in their eyes is we're giving a set amount of money, a certain bundle of cash, we're setting that, and MRTA is going to be giving a percentage. And they kind of played it off like that's the only difference. Do you see that as the case?
Well, I think that is one of the biggest differences is essentially that under the governor's plan, the amount is capped at a dollar amount, going up to 50 million by, I think it's 2026, 2027, something like that. Whereas under the legislature's plan, it's just a percentage of the revenues that come in, and so therefore it could be uncapped. But there's other differences too about insofar as the legislature is much more proactive and making affirmative requirements that the money shall be spent this way. They're putting controls on how much can be spent towards the administrative side of things, whereas the governor's bill doesn't mention any type of controls, doesn't have as much affirmative language, and is more permissive, as in we may do this or things like that. Interesting.
And I know that after a certain chunk is spent on logistics and monitoring the program itself, if you will, of legalization, the MRTA says 50% is going to go towards community reinvestment fund grant, or grant fund, excuse me. What does that mean?
So that is for community organizations to help residents of those communities, disproportionately impacted communities, to help them, to incubator programs, help them in ways that they've been impacted by the war on drugs. And so that's really the big push from the legislature, is giving back to the communities, plus those social equity programs such as the low and zero cost loans and things like that.
The Oneida County Sheriff, when I was talking to him, they said, look, I don't want this, but if we're going to pass this, I certainly want law enforcement to get a certain amount of money so we can have more DREs, drug recognition experts, out in the field, so we can, when we pull someone over, we don't have a mechanism like a breathalyzer right now, but we can have people who are trained to detect impaired driving when it comes to marijuana. Do both plans have money going towards that?
Yeah, so both allocate funds to, I believe, DREs specifically. So it is very much conscious that there is a law enforcement impact. There's data from other states, and it can kind of go both ways. We see maybe small fender benders increase where fatal crashes decrease, perhaps due to substitution effects between THC and alcohol and things like that. But absolutely, both plans recognize there is a law enforcement component to this, and we do need to fund those DREs because at the end of the day, nobody is in support of driving while impaired.
Meg Sanders from Canna Provisions, she said one of the best things Massachusetts did is they didn't have a set number of licenses to give out. They kind of said, like breweries, you want to open one? A dispensary in this case, you can open one. And she says that helps out the little guy. And on that note, before you respond to it, the other concern out there is the medical companies, the medical marijuana companies like Columbia Care, which is right here in Rochester, they have a facility here. They say they have a leg up. They're already doing this. They grow it. And so if you can only get a license for a dispensary and you can't grow, well, that puts the medical companies at an advantage because they can grow through their medical license and then sell through their recreational.
Right. So yes, under the governor's plan, the medical companies would have a tremendous advantage over the smaller companies because they can be what's called vertically integrated. They can grow, they can process, and they can sell. And they can do that in the medical market, and they can do that in the adult use market, and they can sell their products to anybody. So they can grow and sell to some dispensary anywhere in the state. Under the MRTA, that is not the case. The medical companies could be in both the medical and the adult use markets, fully vertically integrated. However, they would be limited to selling in their own dispensaries. So it does give the small businesses the chance to actually compete because when you're vertically integrated, you do save a lot of money in terms of economies of scale and profit margins and things like that.
It does appear in Massachusetts that they do allow vertical integration. Canna Provisions has a cultivation facility up in Sheffield, which is 2 towns away. You have to go through Stockbridge based off of, helped James Taylor write one of my favorite songs. But I find it interesting. Do you think that it would be best if everybody then could vertically integrate in New York?
So I'm a proponent of non-vertical integration. I think that it allows businesses to compete. It makes businesses go out and find other businesses that they need to work with, as opposed to I'm going to consolidate and do everything. And especially because if we're really focused on those disproportionately impacted communities, starting a grow operation, starting a processing operation is multiple millions of dollars. And at the end of the day, it's still federally illegal. You can't go to a bank and get these loans. So you're either self-funding or you're finding private equity to do it, and those are very difficult for those communities.
So you're basically saying, let's keep it separate, but let's make sure the medical companies that can grow perhaps can't get into the recreational that easily.
That's what the MRTA says, and I support the MRTA.
Very interesting. When it comes to price, I did read, Jason, I told you at the start of this, he's a wonk. Your breakdown of how taxes could work along the way is fascinating, because a lot of people who do support this and have been buying marijuana from the black or legacy market, they have a price in mind. And I'm curious to know what their reaction will be when they go to a dispensary to see the price. And the way you broke it down, you have the raw amount, let's say it's $28 for an eighth of marijuana. Well, you add $7.50 or something like that in taxes right off the bat, then the retailer buys it wholesale, will probably mark it up 100%, and then you have the taxes. You could be, correct me if I'm wrong, $75 to $90 pretty quickly. Yep. For an eighth.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's part of the problem that we've been dealing with, that I've personally been dealing with for over 2 years, is really hammering on this tax component. And as mentioned earlier, if we are so far above the illicit market, it makes it hard for the legal market to flourish, especially those smaller stores. The larger companies, they can eat losses. They can create, they can make sure that their products are still competitive. But the smaller companies, it's very difficult, especially with a federal tax law that is very, very harsh towards cannabis.
What price would you like to see that would really keep the black market at bay?
So based on my analyses, I've seen that, if you're within 10% of the illicit market, you're really okay. You're not going to see a huge push towards the illicit market. Consumers will continue to go towards the regulated market. When you start getting, 20, 30, 40, 50% higher, you're really starting to push that bounds. If you're 100% higher, it's not going to be a great market.
If this does pass within the budget, it passes before April 1st, does it become legal immediately?
So that's one of the questions. I am of the opinion that it would. I think that they would allow the medical companies to start selling relatively quickly, to start getting the market online. But obviously, small businesses are going to take a while to ramp up. I don't think that we really could live in a world where the legislature legalizes it, but there's no legal way to obtain, no legal way to possess, or anything like that. So, because in the bill, especially in the CRTA version, the criminality provisions say illicit cannabis is cannabis that hasn't been taxed.
Right.
That would be, by definition, every illicit market.
Exactly. If the product isn't there to purchase legally, can, using the product then, or possession, be legal? And it seemed to me, when Governor Cuomo's office responded to me when I asked about the criminality, in their actual budget, they said illicit possession of cannabis would now be moved up to a misdemeanor. Right now it's a violation. They say, look, if we're going to legalize this, that means if you're in possession of some illicit material, that's now going to be a misdemeanor. But they told me, they're like, that's up for discussion. We're willing to change things in negotiation, which led me to believe if one thing does bend towards the legislative side, it seems like that might.
I mean, we hope it does, right? The whole point of this is to make up for those disproportionately impacted communities. So to increase the penalties again would be a step back. I was speaking to a colleague who said that last year the governor's bill had that same language, and then in a 30-day amendment to the bill, they moved it to basically that it would be, the burden would fall onto the sellers, meaning that if you're selling untaxed cannabis, it gets rid of the penalty to the possessor, who would be, the end user.
Fascinating. All right, well, I have a billion other questions, but I don't want to take up more time, and I don't want to take up more of your time. I can't thank you enough for watching. Jason, one last question for you. We talked about how you do think this is going to pass. I kind of made the point that there's a lot to get through. What are the behind-the-scenes conversations like right now about this?
I think that the legislature and the governor's office are still pretty far apart. And the political realities are that the legislature in both houses have supermajorities, and if they want to, they can try to push the issue, but that remains to be seen.
That is very, very interesting. That's an interesting point, because they are, in a way, in the driver's seat. And correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, I'm going to extend this just a few more minutes here. Those who are backing the legalization from the legislative side, to me, seem to be very passionate about the legalization aspect, not just for revenue, but actually they believe this is the right thing to do. Governor Cuomo has opposed this for years. I think he called it a gateway drug not all that long ago. If you look at his proposal, it's very revenue focused. And so there doesn't appear to be that ideology backing up his position, which to me, if his office comes to the table, you have people who say, if this particular thing, A, B, and C doesn't happen, we don't want legalization because we want to do it right ideologically in a way, or policy-wise. It could create for some interesting conversations.
Absolutely. I think that, we have to look to what Assembly Majority Leader Crystal Peoples-Stokes is saying, and her push. Her and Liz Krueger in the Senate have been the advocates for the MRTA, and just as you said, they are doing it for those policy reasons. It is not about the revenue, it's just about the right thing to do.
Yeah, and Assemblymember Peoples-Stokes, by the way, over in Buffalo, so she's Western New York, and like you said, she is going to go into it from a social justice standpoint, and it's going to be interesting to see how this turns out.
Yes.
Yeah. Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, huge help to me, along with a lot of law enforcement officials in the area, and I can't thank everybody enough for helping us to put this series together. I was surprised to find out the dearth of reporting in this area so far, given how close we are, so I'm glad that we could be a part of it, but I do expect a lot of other reporters across the state to start telling you more about what's going down. And as things change, we'll keep updating you on News 8 over the air and here at rochesterfirst.com. Thank you so much again for watching.